I worry about the will of the West to continue to do what needs to be done.
Strong words from my guest this week, NATO's former Deputy Supreme Commander in Europe, Sir Richard Shirreff.
There is still in Europe, among European countries, a lingering feel that somehow we can go back to some sort of status quo ante with Russia. That is not going to happen.
So what does he think will happen? Some alarming prospects in focus and a loud wake-up call to Europe and America. General Sir Richard Shirreff, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you very much, and good to be with you.
Ukraine has chalked up some successes on the battlefield in recent weeks. They've actually taken back control of drilling platforms now in the Black Sea. But I wondered if you could give us an idea of some of the scale of the challenges Kiev now faces in order to make further advances.
I think it would be really difficult to overestimate the challenge. I mean, the Ukrainians are ranged against well-established Russian defenses. The Russians have had time to dig in. They know about digging in. They've dug in probably by the book. And the Ukrainians have got to break into that very, very well-established defensive zone, break through it. They've got to take down minefields. They've got to cope with significant artillery incoming fire. They've got to break through, and then they've got to break out. And they've got to do all of this without proper air cover, without air superiority, which no NATO army would consider doing. And in fact, what they're doing is what no NATO army, full stop, has done, an opposed obstacle crossing in really difficult circumstances.
No other NATO army, with the exception of the US, could even take this on, could it, in their current forms?
Oh, I think any NATO army that aspires to high-intensity combat operations would be prepared to take this on, but not without an extraordinary amount of time, preparation, training, building up equipment, building up ammunition, and doing it. I mean, in a sense, this is what the coalition did in '91, was to break through the Iraqi defensive position, but it was unopposed. So it was pretty easy going. Nobody's done this since the Second World War in Europe.
NATO's armies have spent years on counter-insurgency in places like Iraq, as you mentioned, Afghanistan. So they're not exactly used to defending against a huge invasion. But your emphasis in the last few months has been on telling them that they should. Is that what you think is going to happen?
I think if NATO is to deter Russia long term, NATO's got to be prepared for the worst case, which is to be prepared to fight Russia. NATO armies have got to put the counterinsurgency mindset behind them and rekindle that spirit and understanding of high-intensity combat operations, which was the underpinning of NATO armies during the Cold War. Now, that's going back a very long time. And so the new generation have got to find ways to do that.
NATO hasn't exactly looked fleet of foot recently, has it? We've seen its members' armies have spent a few days in Latvia training, where someone just realized that not all NATO personnel speak the same language with the same degree of proficiency. And never mind tank traps, 3 out of 24 British military vehicles broke down on the motorway. It's not impressive, is it, at the moment?
Well, NATO, I mean, I remain a fan of NATO, but you have to recognize with NATO that it takes time, that it's a consensus organization, and it's got to be able to, it has to move at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. I mean, coming back to your tactical, that's a strategic point. Your tactical points that you're talking about, well, that's what exercises are for, to test and to get it right, and to understand where things are going wrong, and so that you can put them right. NATO fleet of foot, NATO multinational operations, at least it's there, but it needs to hone its capability, and needs to hone its capability by training. And if it can do that and really pursue pursue excellence, then it can begin to build up that deterrent capability that is needed.
But if they don't build up that excellence now, and when are they going to do it? We're more than 18 months into the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War. Shouldn't things be going a little better these days?
Well, I'd have liked to have seen things going rather better from the start, and right from the start. I mean, we need to recognise this war didn't begin in February 2022. It began in March 2014 when Russia attacked Ukraine. Arguably February 2014 when it annexed Crimea. And if NATO had woken up then and really put in place the measures required to build up its high-intensity capability, A, we might not be where we are, and B, Ukraine might not be where we are. Anyway, fact is, we are where we are. So what? So shoulders to the grindstone, make it happen, drive on, and you can't afford not to do that sort of thing. So I'm with you completely.
Last year, Estonia's Prime Minister Kaja Kallas warned that under NATO's previous plans for defending the Baltic states, her country would basically have been wiped out off the map by a Russian advance. Did NATO's extensive planning staff over all the years of the Cold War simply miss that possibility?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote my book, War with Russia, highlighting the threat to the Baltic states, written as a wake-up call to get NATO thinking about what it would do, because Kaja Kallas was absolutely right, that if the Russians attacked, it would have presented NATO with two options. One, rollover, accept. Number two, mount a massive invasion of the Baltic states to recapture them. And so it is absolutely right now. And I'm not privy to the planning, but NATO is putting in place extensive plans to defend NATO territory, which is exactly what it should be doing. But at the same time, it's one thing to put the plans in place. It needs the means to protect. And that brings us back to building up NATO's deterrent capability. And that means focusing on high-intensity conflict and the capabilities required for high-intensity conflict.
It also means providing the cash to do this, doesn't it? I mean, you've got the three largest economies in NATO. You've got France, Germany and Italy still not paying 2% of GDP towards defence. So what kind of signal does that send to the Kremlin? They couldn't care less?
It sends a pretty poor signal. I think let's look at the positives first. I mean, the positives of countries like Poland, absolutely building up its capability. Go the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, likewise. Of course, it goes without saying that. I was in the Czech Republic recently. The Czech Republic are really putting their money where their mouth is and building up their capabilities. But you are absolutely right. Countries like Germany, Italy, France, not yet beginning to spend 2% of GDP. Indeed, the German defense budget for 2023 is lower than it was for 2022. What sort of signal does that send? What does that tell you about the so-called Zeitenwende, this so-called moment of great change when Germany was going to guarantee 2% of GDP year on year in defense? I would also I wouldn't let Britain off the hook either. I mean, Rishi Sunak has said Britain will spend 2%, 2.5% of GDP when the economy allows. That, I'm afraid, isn't good enough. And we're a long way short in this country. So the Western European countries, frankly, need to wake up.
If you were wargaming this conflict in Ukraine with all the stark logistical, military, political uncertainties thrown into the mix, how worried would you be?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm also a realist. I think that Ukraine will achieve its military objectives. Ukraine is not going to stop fighting. The determination, the will in Ukraine is absolutely extraordinary. Ukrainians know that if they stop fighting, Ukraine will stop existing as a country. So they will go on fighting until they've defeated Russia, with or without the West. What does worry me, though, is the West's support for Ukraine, American support for Ukraine. We're coming up to an election year. 3 of the leading Republican contenders have said they would pull American support from Ukraine. And an election year means potential indecision and stasis. I worry about the level of capability support in Britain, for example, whether Britain can continue to dig deep and provide the ammunition and other capabilities that Ukraine needs. I worry about prevarication. For example. Germany still hasn't made up its mind whether to send Taurus, the long-range precision missile, seriously capable and exactly what Ukraine needs to complement its HIMARS and the British Storm Shadow as well. So I worry about the will of the West to continue to do what needs to be done. And there's a simple equation here. If the West does what needs to be done, the West is going to be more secure because it will mean Ukraine can defeat Russia quickly. If this thing runs on and on and on, the West and Europe as a whole will be less secure and in jeopardy.
So, Richard, we don't talk much about honour in wars these days, but is it an honourable stance, in your view, for the West to say to Ukraine, OK, you go ahead and fight and die for our values, and we'll give you some of what you need to do that, but we're not going to risk upsetting your enemy too much so that he turns on us? Is that honourable?
Well, I think it's difficult to, I think it would be very difficult to portray that as honourable. And I deplore, for example, the notion that somehow the West and NATO should be insisting that Ukraine fights a war that meets the way that NATO would do it. My view is simple. Give the Ukrainians the means to do the job and let them get on with it. Provide the support in terms of intelligence and cyber and EW, of course, but don't try and second-guess Ukrainian generals. They know what works. They have been fighting the Russians now for over 18 months, and they have worsted the Russians. They have demonstrated they're better, but what they still lack is real capability. And equally, your point about tying the constraints on Ukraine, it is absolutely right for Ukraine to be able to defend itself and to practice that inalienable right of self-defense. And if that means striking into Russia, well, so be it. I'm afraid this self-deterrence, as it were, by the West has only resulted in the prolongation of the war. If Ukraine had had the means to really follow up the liberation of Kherson in November last year, things might be different. As it was, they didn't have the capability because the West had not given them what they really needed in a timely manner. And that allowed the Russians to reestablish their front line, Surovikin to start building the so-called Surovikin line of defense, making it much, much more difficult for the Ukrainians. So there's a simple equation in war. If you clout, if you concentrate effort, if you really go for it, then you can achieve your aims. If you dribble, if you prevaricate, you're going to make things much worse because it's going to take much, much longer.
You talk about Ukraine striking into Russian territory. With cluster bombs, have you no qualms about that? 100 countries have outlawed them.
Cluster bombs are a vile aspect of warfare. Of course they are. And I absolutely deplore the use of cluster bombs. But if Ukraine needs cluster bombs to clear Russian trench systems on Ukrainian territory, that is a completely different attitude. That is a matter for the Ukrainians. But what Ukraine does need is long-range precision capabilities so that it can target Russian logistic installations, headquarters, and the like, and make it very difficult for the Russians.
You've got a wide, influential circle of Ukrainian contacts, government, parliament, military, intelligence. In May, you even spent the night in a bomb shelter in Kiev. Is that right?
I spent part of a night in a bomb shelter along with many other people who visited Ukraine.
What was the mood like?
Inspirational, determined, absolutely. This is rather, the Ukrainians, as I said earlier, are absolutely determined to fight to protect their liberty. They recognize that this is a war not just against Ukraine, but it's a war against the West and Ukraine joining the West. The determination, the inspiration, the ingenuity, the relative youth of the leadership. This is a dynamic country determined to protect itself and to build itself up and to become a firm part of the West.
Were people afraid about what the West might do or might not do to help them? Are they losing faith in the West?
I think they are enormously grateful to the West for what the West has given them. I think, understandably, there is frustration that the West is trying to second guess them and tell them how to use it. Where a number of recent articles, which I think have made the point in the West, we're trying to second guess the Ukrainians. But fundamentally, I think Ukrainians are absolutely grateful. But let them get on, as I said earlier. Let them get on and do what they need to do without interfering with them.
And the comments like, we'll be with you all the way for as long as it takes, they listen to those coming out of Brussels, they listen to those coming out of Washington. Do they believe them? Do you believe them?
Well, I take them at the face value, but I do worry, as I said earlier, whether that will continue. And let's be positive, actually. Let's be clear. For example, yes, the NATO summit was very clear in terms of the support, but I would like to have seen also a clear statement at the NATO summit that Ukraine will join NATO when the conditions allow, when the fighting has stopped. And I would have added, and we are going to give you, without any let or hindrance, everything you need to make that fighting stop as quickly as possible. In other words, to defeat the Russians and achieve and bring back territory, Ukrainian territory, under Ukrainian sovereignty and control.
General, how finely balanced is this war in your view? How could things go badly wrong for Ukraine? What are the possible inflection points that Ukraine needs to watch for?
Well, Ukraine's got to continue to defend. The Russians will continue to mount offensive operations where they see opportunities, as they are indeed mounting some form of offensive in the northern part of Luhansk, it appears, but without effective result. So Ukraine's got to continue to protect itself, protect its center of gravity, its source of strength. And its source of strength is its people and its will and its determination. The alliance, NATO alliance, has also got to protect its source of strength, which is its alliance cohesion. I think Ukraine will prevail. I think Ukraine is prevailing at the moment, but it will only achieve final victory when it has broken through and put the Russian defenses and, in my view, threatened Crimea, and threaten those lines of communication down to Crimea, making it very impossible for the Russians to hold on. And that is going to require a huge amount more effort. And let's be also clear, it's not going to be over with one offensive. I think we have to be ready to support the Ukrainians in a series of counteroffensives, all of which are going to require the same levels of training, equipment, ammunition that the launching of the first offensive requires. So this could run on for time. So the West, NATO, needs the strategic patience to continue to support Ukraine to the end of the game.
You held out the possibility, I think it was in an article in May, that if the West doesn't supply all the hardware Ukraine needs now, victory may not be possible, and NATO troops might have to intervene directly to assure that Kiev wins. Do you think that's a real possibility? Is that something that NATO would ever seriously contemplate?
NATO never seriously contemplated before 2014 or even after 2014 an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. NATO never seriously contemplated that the Baltic states would be threatened. You can never say never.
But that's what it was set up to defend against, wasn't it?
Well, but it never. Do you really? If it really seriously thought NATO would, Russia would invade Ukraine, I think you'd have seen a completely different approach to deterrence back at the Cardiff NATO summit in 2014, for example. So never rule anything out. Is NATO going to have to get involved? I pray not. But if the alternative is a decade of stalemate, a decade of enormous casualties, a running sore in Eastern Europe, who knows? NATO air power might need to get involved in order to swing the balance, because that sort of stalemate, a running sore in Eastern Europe along the borders of Ukraine, is going to be a threat to European security. And if at the end of the day European security is threatened, NATO security is threatened, NATO may have to take action to support Ukraine. But the way to avoid that, the way to avoid NATO engagement, is to double down now and next year on what Ukraine needs to achieve victory.
But just to follow up on how you think this might go, do you think that NATO would ever achieve consensus on a plan to move in and directly assist Ukrainian forces, with members like Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, Turkey, all possessing a veto? You think NATO would ever get its act together to do that?
Well, of course, Austria is not a NATO member, but your point is absolutely fair that, of course, consensus would be incredibly difficult to get under such circumstances. But as I said earlier, NATO moves at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. And if the threat is there, the circumstances are there, and they're clearly not there at the moment, but who knows, in 10 years' time, things may well have changed. And if it needs to, NATO will get there.
You've talked in some of your interviews about a war lasting 2 to 3 years. No quick fixes. Is there a danger that over such a long period that war is almost normalized? It drops from the headlines, people get bored, they lose the fighting spirit, money dries up, other priorities begin to dominate. Is that a possibility in this instance, do you think?
Absolutely, Tim. Absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm worried about. The West losing interest, the West losing momentum, the West losing focus, NATO armies, NATO defense forces not building themselves up to face being built up to face the threat. And absolutely, that's my concern that as I said earlier, with an election year next year in America, will America continue to provide that enormous capability? And that's something we've got to watch. And it comes back to my point about the way to make sure that Ukraine achieves its victories quickly is to double down on what it needs now in order to avoid that long-running stalemate.
Do you foresee, what kind of Europe do you foresee coming out of this war? It's not going to be the same, is it? Nothing is ever going to be the same again after this war. It changes everything, changes doctrine, it changes our whole perception of security in Europe, doesn't it?
I think there is still in Europe, among European countries, a lingering feel that somehow we can go back to some sort of status quo ante with Russia. That is not going to happen. Whatever happens here, let's assume Ukraine achieves its military objectives. Let's assume the guns fall silent, that there is some, as a result of either the Russians run up the white flag or there's an armistice or something, and the Ukrainians are able to liberate as much of their country as will allow them the security that they're looking for. That is not going to stop Russia, that Russian desire under whatever leader is in the Kremlin. Russia will continue to want to eliminate Ukraine from the map. It's built into Russian DNA that Ukraine cannot exist as a country. There is no such thing as a separate nation or culture of Ukraine. And that means that Ukraine has got to become part of NATO. And that means that in order to protect NATO, protect Europe, protect the alliance, protect Ukraine, NATO has got to establish a band of deterrent steel around Eastern Europe, to include Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, maybe even one day Belarus, to protect against Russia. Because what we're witnessing is the decline of the Russian Empire. And this is going to play out over decades to come. It's not going to be over and done with quickly. It's yours and my grandchildren who are going to be facing this challenge. And so the only way to maintain peace in Europe long term is through an effective NATO deterrence. And that is going to change the dynamic in economically, financially, and the way Europe does its business. And I don't think the penny has completely dropped yet, but that's my view of the way things are going to happen.
Do you think the doctrine of nuclear deterrence is going to survive this conflict now that Russia's been waving its nukes in our faces? And are we going to see all the other nuclear-armed states doing the same thing whenever they want something that we won't give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to be really careful about assuming that somehow, because we've got, in this country, we've got Trident and intercontinental ballistic missiles, that is going to credibly deter Russian aggression. To deter effectively, you need to be able to deter at every level: asymmetric, conventional, tactical nuclear, and all the way up the scale. I think for the foreseeable future, Russia, of course, will pose a nuclear threat. The way to deter it is to have effective nuclear deterrence as well as conventional deterrence. But the way to ensure that the nuclear saber-rattling is in a sense rendered meaningless is through effective conventional deterrence. Because if Russia thinks that it can get away with nuclear blackmail, then it will try that. And if you have effective deterrence at every level, it won't be able to.
But very briefly, isn't the bigger problem that the West has shown it listens to nuclear blackmail? It's been listening to what the Kremlin has said. It's toned down its rhetoric. It hasn't given Ukraine the weapons it needs. It listens to nuclear blackmail, and that makes it vulnerable to places like North Korea, doesn't it?
Well, this goes back to my point about self-deterrence and not calling Putin's bluff. I mean, let's be clear. Any sort of nuclear saber-rattling is really, really dangerous. But here the West needs to be absolutely unequivocal, and I'm sure this has happened. I mean, I think we have to accept, and of course it's there. There is communication between America and Russia. There is communication between certain other NATO capitals and Russia, and I am absolutely certain that the message has been played out very carefully, that if there is any form of nuclear release, tactical or otherwise, Russia can expect to suffer massive pain conventionally as a result. But the West needs to be clear and determined about that.
So Richard Shirreff, we've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for being on Conflict Zone.
Thank you for having me.
Grateful for your time. Thank you.